Hello, everyone. Welcome back, and we continue studying Tanya. For the past 3 chapters, we've been learning about the godly soul and the breakup of the godly soul, and now we're going to continue back to the topic of the animal soul. Chapter 6, Perek Vav. V'hine ze leumat ze asa Elohim. God created everything dual, one and the opposite. That means that everything in holiness, in kedusha, there's also found in impurity, in things that are not godly, things that are the opposite of God. Like, for example, everything that comes out of something from the essence is in opposites. Like, for example, pleasure. Pleasure has an opposite. The opposite of pleasure would be pain and suffering, and so on and so forth. Or, for example, let's say the holding back of a certain pleasure. That would be the opposite of the pleasure. Everything has the opposite counterpart that it's created with. And that's the same way everything in holiness, even the godly soul, has a counterpart. And that's something that parallels it and is similar to it in the opposite way. And it counters it. And the reason that God did this is because if everything was different, if everything was separated, if everything was just godliness and godliness had the upper hand, then there would be no free will. So in order for there to be free will, there needs to be the exact opposite amount of pressure coming from whatever's countering godliness, in order that we should all be able to have free will. כי כמו שנפש האלוהית כלולה מעשר ספירות קדושות ומתלבשת בשלושת לבושים קדושים, כך הנפש שתסיתך אחורה מקליפות הדור גם מלובש בדם האדם כלולה מעשר קיטרין דמיסבותה. So the same way the godly soul is composed, like we said, of 10 levels, which are holy, because everything in the godly soul is holy, meaning it's godly, and which we said earlier, the godly intellect and the godly emotions, and it also has the 3 garments to express itself in, which are thought, speech, and action. The same way the animal soul also has 10 levels, and they are called in the Zohar the 10 crowns of impurity, which means things that are the counter to God, counter to godliness, and they are what basically is an entity to separate itself from God, separate itself from godliness. Shehen Sheva midot raot about ma'ar beisodot chaim. We mentioned earlier that there are 4 foundations, which are basically everything in the world is composed of 4 elements of fire, water, air, and earth, or in other language, solid, liquid, gas, and energy. So the same way is also the animal soul is made up of those 4 elements. And each one of those elements actually now sprouts out and branches into 7 emotions, which are the 7 evil emotions, which are the emotions that are counter to God, that separate through those emotions, are separate to God. V'sechel hamolidan hanechlek l'shalosh hanchochma bina v'dat makoch hamidot, and the intellect that creates the emotions is the same as it is in the godly soul, mirrored. Chochma first, and then we had bina, and then we had das. Those are the 3 intellectual powers which are the source of the emotions. I should note that the difference between the animal soul and the godly soul is that the animal soul is mainly made up of emotions, whereas the godly soul is mainly made up of intellect. For there to be emotions in the godly soul, it's not going to exist by itself. Emotions don't just happen by the godly soul. They actually the godly soul has to think and have an intellectual process, which we explained earlier. And in order for those emotions to be created, they have to actually be actively created for the godly soul. But for the animal soul, it's quite the opposite. There's always emotions. Emotions always exist. And in order for the intellect to happen, that actually has to work hard for that intellect to be created. So as soon as someone, for example, sees a good food or sees something that sparks their animalistic emotions, then their emotions are already there, and they automatically jump for the food or whatever the desire might be, because the emotions stay for the animal soul. It's the intellect that doesn't stay. But nevertheless, they're similar stature, similar level. The emotions in the intellect are always going to be on a similar vibration. Actually, the reason it's called the animal soul is because just as an animal that doesn't think before it acts, it just goes based off of its emotions. The same way, the animal soul's main thing is not thinking. Its main driver is its emotions, as opposed to the godly soul, whose main driver is the intellect. But nevertheless, the point that we're stressing over here is that they mirror each other. And there's 3 intellect and 7 emotions in both. Ki hamidot hen lefi erech hasechel. Ki hakatan choshet ve'ohev dvarim ktanim pchutei erech. Lefi shesichlo katan v'katzar lasik dvarim yikarim yoter mehem. So nevertheless, a person's emotions and intellect are still on the same level. Like I said before, they're on the same vibration. So therefore, as you see, by a child likes things that are petty and of little value. And that's the reason that he likes those things. His emotions are excited about little things, petty things, is because a child's intellect is small and unable to think about and process bigger things, which are more valuable than them. As people say, the difference between men and boys is the size of their toys. Because of the intellect that they have, it's all according to the greatness, the broadness of their understanding is their emotions. וכן מתכעס ומתקצף מדברים קטנים, וכן בהתפרעות ושך מידות. And so too, a child, as you see, not only does he love things that are small, but he gets angry, the opposite, about things that are small. And he takes pride in things that are small. And all the other emotions, there's 7 emotions. One is love, one is staying away from something, and one is having pride in something, and there's 4 others, which each one of them have a way to express themselves in the animal soul. For example, love for evil things, severity and anger, and being vexed at certain things, murder even, and having a feeling of pride for things that are evil, and glory for things that are evil. Now, what happens when a person thinks, speaks, or does or acts out with these 10 levels, intellect and emotions? כשהאדם מחשב בהן, או מדבר, או עושה, הרי מחשבתו שבמוחו, ודיבורו שבפיו, וכוח המעשים שידיים, ושאר איבריו, נקראים לבושי מסבו, לעשר בחינות אלו הטמאות, שמתלבשות בהן בשעת מעשה, או דיבור, או מחשבה. Now, when a person, like we said, expresses those 10 levels, the intellect and emotions of the animal soul, which are impure, which are things, we're about to define it in a minute, what exactly they are, in their thought, speech, and action, and then they become a chariot, so to speak, for the animal, for these 10 levels of the animal soul, which it comes into. Now, what exactly are these things that are evil, impure, and so on, that a person actually comes into with their thought, speech, and action? Vehen hem kol hamaisim asher nasim tachat hashemesh. It's anything of any kind of action, it says, that are done under the sun. Asher kol hevel v'raut ruach And all of them are vanity and affliction of the spirit, and they break the spirit of holiness. In other words, all things that are done in this world, it doesn't matter what they are, if they don't have an intention for holiness, for kedusha, then they are categorized as impure and evil. Anything, if a person doesn't have God in mind when they're doing a action, then that action is categorized as evil and impure. And it breaks, those actions break the holiness. Those actions break kedusha, which is godliness. They break the godliness behind it. And it's important to state over here that when we say that there's sitra achra, that means the other side. What does the other side mean? That means the other side that is not God. That's basically doesn't take God into account, as we're about to explain. Not just actions, but also speeches and thoughts which are not for the purpose of God are all considered under the umbrella of sitra achra, of impurity, and things that are on the other side. Shezehu pirush lashon sitra achra, pirush tzad acher, she'eno tzad hakdusha. That is exactly what sitra achra means. The forces which are the other side. That's the other side that's not godliness, that's not holiness. Anything that is not meant for God, doesn't have God in mind for serving Him or for whatever God wants, then those things are categorized as the other side. And as a matter of fact, this does not necessarily mean things that are forbidden, like whatever it might be, idolatry, murder, stealing, etc. These are even things that are permitted. There's nothing wrong with eating them, with doing them. Even eating, or even regular mundane activities, playing basketball, I don't know, whatever there are things that are permitted. When a person doesn't have God in mind when doing those things, then it is already under the umbrella of the other side of things that are not God. There's, like we said back in chapter 1, there's two things in this world. There's things that are connected to God, and there's things that are the opposite, are not God. They don't have God in mind. They just exist without God, and they are sitra achra, the other side. And that is what the whole function of the animal soul does. That's what the animal soul gets itself into. By the animal soul's 10 levels, intellect and emotions, thinking about things, speaking things, and acting things, which don't have God in mind, even if they're okay, they're permitted, but they don't have God in mind, then they are categorized as coming from the forces which are not God. Sitra achra. V'tzad hakdusha eino ela hashcha v'hamshacha mikdushato shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What is the side of God? The side of a God can only be a shining and a bringing down of God's holiness. And God does not dwell on something that is not surrendering itself to Him. The only place that God is able to dwell, so to speak, is on something that is surrendered to Him. Because God is the only thing that really exists in essence. God is one. Everything else is nothing. So if someone does something without having God in mind, then what they're basically saying is, I'm an independent identity. I exist. I exist outside of God's realm. And if I exist outside of God's realm, then that means that God, who is the only thing that really exists, can't live with you. God can't live with a person, can't be with a person that sees themselves as an independent identity from his truth of existence, which is that he's the only identity that exists. Ben bepoel mamash kemalachim elyonim, and that can be practical surrendering to God, which is like the angels above, which their entire existence of the angels is just fulfilling God's desire. And therefore, God dwells with them because their identity, their existence is an existence of God's will. Ben bekoach kechol ish yischa lemata shebekoch litbad mamash legab hakadosh baruch hu b'msiach dram shor kedushat Hashem, or if it's just potential, like every Jew that in potential has the ability that can come out any second to surrender their life for the sanctity of God. As we've seen in history many times over, where there were times that Jewish people were put to the test or to die, and that's the end of it, or to serve idolatry or anything other than God and choose to live. And many, many instances, there's many stories where they chose to die and not, I deny God's existence. And then there you see that the potential they had on the inside to become surrendered to God came out in practice. But even before it comes out, even before it actually happens in practicality, it's still there in potential. And therefore, God dwells within the Jewish people, even when the Jewish people are not doing what they're supposed to do. And they're doing things that are impure, that are opposite to what God wants, and ignore what God wants. But God is there within them, because in potential, they are surrendered to God. Any minute it can happen. And this is also what the prophet Isaiah, Ishayahu, tells the Jewish people. He rebukes the Jewish people. And he tells them that a ox knows its master, but the Jewish people don't know God. An ox, when you think about it, how an ox knows its master, an ox is an ox. It doesn't have a mind. It doesn't think and say, oh, this is what a master means intellectually. An ox just knows that it has a master, and it does whatever the master leads it to do. It's always following its master. The Jewish people have to do the same thing. You don't have to be an intellectual, wise man and understand what is God and what's our relationship to God. And at all times we have to think to ourselves, oh, this is the quality of God's existence. Instead, like an ox, we have to just be aware on the inside that there's God, and we have to follow Him. Always be conscious of Him. When we're waking up in the morning, having breakfast, having lunch, playing baseball, whatever it is, we have in mind God. We're always having in mind that we're following God in every place that we are. And we're not forgetting Him. ולכן אמרו חז"ל, שאפילו אחד שיושב ועוסק בתורה, שכינה שכויה חודו. וכל בישרה שכינתה שכינה לעולם. And that's what the sages of blessed memory say, that even one who sits and learns Torah, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, in other words, God, is with them. And anytime there are 10 Jews together, God is with them at all times. And this actually ties back to what we said earlier in chapters 4 and 5, that the Torah is God's will and wisdom. So when a Jew learns Torah, they have and are accessing God's will and wisdom, and God's will and wisdom, which is one with Him Himself, is with them at the moment that they're doing that they're thinking the Torah, or that they're doing the mitzvah. So that's what exactly what we're saying over here. When a Jew does Torah, when a Jew does mitzvot, then they are becoming a connecting point for which God can come down into this world. Whereas anything that does not have God in mind, it doesn't matter if it's forbidden or permissible. Being that God is not in the picture, God doesn't come into it. God doesn't come into the picture. Like he continues over here. יתברך, אלא הוא דבר נפרד בפני עצמו, אינו מקבל חיות בקדושתו של הקדוש ברוך הוא מבחינת פנימית, הקדושה, מהותה ועצמותה בכבודה בעצמה. Anything that is not surrendered to God doesn't receive its life from God's essence, from the inside of God, from the internal part of godliness. In other words, from the higher levels of godliness. But instead from the outer part of godliness. There's the inside and the outside. And someone that does not have surrendering to God, or at a certain moment doesn't, then they receive their life force from the outer part of God. שיורדים ממדרגה למדרגה, רבת מדרגות בהשתלשלות העולמות דרך עילה ועלול וצמצומים רבים, עד שנטמע את כל כך האור והחיות מיעוט אחר מיעוט, עד שיכול לצמצם ולהתלבש בבחינת גלות, תוך אות הדבר הנבחד, דרכיותו ולקיימו מאין ליש, שלא יחסוך להיות עין ואפס, כי בתחילה מקודם שנברא. So, what's the process exactly? The godly, how can something have a life from God if it's disconnected from God? We just said that a person that doesn't, or any thought, any speech, any action that does not have God in mind, then what happens is it becomes disconnected from godliness. So the minute a person does something without having God in mind, they're disconnected from God. How can they exist? We know that the entire existence of everything in the world is from God. So the minute that a person disconnects themselves, even before, the minute that they do it, the second they do it, they should cease to exist, really. So how do they still exist? How do they still have life? So because God, I guess, out of His kindness, or whatever reason it is, we'll actually learn about it in the third part of Tanya, chapter 6. We're not there yet, but which is actually funny because this is also chapter 6, so you see that connection. But it comes down, the godliness comes down, and it has to actually become smaller and smaller. It can't receive that thought, that speech, that action can't receive a revelation from the way it is up in holiness, in godliness. It has to become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and go through the processes of cause and effect, where you have the higher level and then the lower level, and you're constantly breaking it apart and making it smaller and smaller, this life force, in order that it should come into this thing in a form of exile, this thing that is separate from godliness, to give it life and to make it exist from nothing, so it shouldn't go back to nothingness like it was before it was created. Now, what does it mean, come into something like lihit labesh, as a clothing? A clothing is something that fits a person. So too, the godliness that comes into something fits it on its level. So The same way that you are one size of clothing and you can't wear a bigger or smaller size, you have just the right size of clothing that you're wearing, so too the godly life force to create you at all times comes into you, or comes into your thought, speech, and action according to the measure of it. And when a person's thought, speech, and action is without having God in mind, then that small, limited measure of godliness that comes to create them is basically considered like an exile for the godliness that's creating it, from the godliness that it originated from. Exile, prison, these are all synonymous words, which is, and basically describes a person in a place where they can't express themselves properly. The godliness is much greater than this thought, speech, or action. And when it comes into the thought, speech, or action, it becomes limited and squashed, and it can't express itself. That's the idea of exile, that it comes into those thoughts, speech, and action. It actually is so small, and that it basically only the true source of life force where it comes from only hovers over it from on top, because it can't come into it. And therefore this world and its entirety is called the world, it's called, I think, in the Kabbalistic works, and the world of klipa and sitra achra. Like we mentioned earlier, klipa is the bad part of the fruit, and the sitra achra is the other side, other to God. This world is called the world of klipa and sitra achra. Then why? Because that is the essence of this world. This world has come down to such a low point where everything in the world, or not everything, but most of everything, functions without God in mind, without surrendering to godliness. And the godliness is so limited in this world that it's almost in a form of exile in this world. And therefore, all actions of this world are severe and evil. And we mentioned the meaning of evil again is not what God wants, against God's will. And the wicked are on top in this world. And now, there's a footnote to note. The author writes as follows: Im hiyot betocho esech sfichot asiyah dektusha, וכמו שכתוב בעץ חיים שח מ"ג, ובתוך esech sfichot asiyah elu, הן esech sfichot יצירה, ובתוכן esech sfichot הבריאה, ובתוכן esech sfichot האצילות שבתוכן אור אינסוף ברוך הוא, ונמצא אור אינסוף ברוך הוא, מעלה כל הארץ על הזרוע התחתונה על ידי תפשוטו בעסך ספיחות בארבע עולמות הביאה, כמו שכתוב בעץ חיים שח מ"ז פרק ב' ובספר חיגולים פרק כ'. This is actually a dual thing that's happening at the same time. On the one hand, it is severed from God, so to speak. It's not severed, separated from God, because it doesn't have God in mind. All the thoughts, speech, and actions of this world and so on are evil. But at the same time, within this world, functioning, it's concealed, but you have the 10 levels which of the holy world, which is the world of Asiya. There's 4 worlds in holiness and kedusha and godliness. From lower to higher, we're going at this rate. So within this world, our world, you have the lowest of the holy worlds, which is Asiya. So that's already considered holy. And then within that world of Asiya, you have the second holier world, which is made up of 10 levels. And then you have within that the third holy world, which is Bria, which is also made up of 10 levels, so it's even holier. And then you have very, very holy, you have the fourth holier, the fourth of the holy worlds, which is the world of Atzilut, which within that world comes in God or in Sof. God comes in and shines into that world. So that means that within everything, really, in essence, everything, God is found in everything. And everything there is God. And as a matter of fact, even the things in the world that appear to us as separate from God, in essence, they only exist because God is giving them life. God is within everything, ultimately. So we might not see it that way because we're not necessarily living on a level where God is something that we're aware of all the time. But we can tap into that. But in everything, in essence, God is in everything and God fills everything. So in general, in Klipa, there's two levels, one lower than the other one. And I'll just start off by saying that we're only going to cover, we're at the end of the chapter, we're coming up to the end, we're only going to cover the lower level of Klipa. And the second higher level of Klipa, we're only going to actually explain in the next chapter, in chapter 7. המדרגה התחתונה היא 3 קליפות הטמאות ורעות לגמרי, ואין בהם טוב כלל. The lower level of klipa, which is the klipa is a peel. The peel is the bad of the fruit. It's the part of the fruit that's no good. That lower level of it it's actually divided into 3. There's 3 different types of it. It comes into 3 forms, the lower level of klipa. And it is completely impure, completely evil, meaning, obviously, like I said before, it never has any intention for God. And they're v'nikreu b'mechevet Yecheskel ruach tzara ve'anan gadol v'chulu in the Gomer. And the chariot of Yecheskel, he was the prophet Ezekiel. When he speaks about the chariot, he speaks about the 3 klipot, and he gives them different names: the storm wind, the great cloud, and there's another one which I'm not aware of. He doesn't say it here. So there's 3 parts of the lower level of klipa, which is completely evil, completely doesn't have any good at all. ומהן נשפעות ונמשכות נפשות כל אומות העולם וקיום גופם. And from them flow and are derived the souls of all of the nations of the world, the kiyum gufa, and the sustenance of their bodies, the souls and the bodies of all the nations of the world as a whole come from this lower level of klipot. ונפשות כל בעלי חיים הטמאים והאסורים באכילה וקיום גופם. And so now we're not only, you'd think, okay, so only in people, there's a kind of people that's derived from the lower level of klipa. No, not only in people, also in animals. There's animals that are also derived from this lower level of klipa, which is all animals which are forbidden according to the Torah. Any animal that's forbidden to eat, the soul of the animal and the body of the animal, again, we're stressing there's 2 things. There's a soul and a body. So there are 2 levels, one higher, one lower. So in the animal category, any animal that is forbidden to eat, its soul and body comes from the lower level of klipa, and not just people and animals, but also lower than that. וחיות כל מאכלות הסוכות מהצומח, כמו אורלה וכלי הכרם, חולו, כמו שכתוב בעץ חיים, שח במתת פרק ו'. Also vegetation, anything that's in vegetation that's not kosher, its life comes from the lower level of klipa. For example, I mean, you might think that all vegetables and fruits and vegetables are all kosher. As a matter of fact, there's many fruits and vegetables that are not kosher, that are forbidden to eat. Like, for example, the arla, which is the first 3 years of produce that comes from a tree. Or kilayim, the mixed species when two species are mixed together, and etc. As all this is explained in the book Etz Chaim. And within the Jewish people, that we just categorize outside of the Jewish people, in the world as a whole, in the categories of people, animals, and plants. Within the Jewish people, that would be the three garments of the animal soul, which are thought, speech, and action of any one of the 365 negative commandments. In the Torah, there's 365, I guess we'll call them sins. 365 sins and their branches all come from the lower level of Klippa. Stay tuned for the higher level of Klippa in chapter 7. Thank you so much for joining.